Ever wondered what would happen if your favorite Power Ranger suddenly gets isekai to a fantasy world? Do you think he'll be able to dominate over wizards and warriors with his crazy alien tech and cringe poses? Or perhaps he'll just get his butt kicked. Either way, this Ranger's story is sure to bring a lot of epic battles and incredibly out-of-this-world hilarious moments. Quite literally. Let's get started. Our story begins on a dreadful day where a giant, evil alien ship brings devastating destruction to a city. The ship had also sustained damage, as inside we can see a red Power Ranger facing off against a villain called the Exterminator King, who was firing multiple lasers from his body. As the Red Ranger prepared a powerful punch, he shouted his promise to protect his world. The immense force from the clash between Red Ranger and the Exterminator King caused the entire airship to explode. But before losing consciousness, Red Ranger whispered to himself that he would leave the rest to his teammates. Because of this, the other Rangers stopped fighting out of concern for Red Ranger, whom they knew was caught in the airship's explosion. Now we see Red Ranger falling, nearly unconscious and beginning to reminisce about his life story with the other Rangers who were his best friends. He admits their plan wasn't perfect, but he's still happy that he managed to save the world and give people hope. Nevertheless, he wished he could have spent a little more time with his friends before passing away. But while he was thinking, he suddenly hit the ground and felt the pain from the impact. 6 months later, inside a trembling mansion, there was a swordsman and a knight, both wounded and facing a terrifying opponent. They couldn't fight back against their golem opponent and could only dodge because it was too powerful for the two of them. But they reached a point where they were both so exhausted that they finally surrendered to their opponent. Because of this, a beautiful lady commented that these adventurers were also failures. Her butler agreed and said there was nothing they could do about it. So Lady Adola stopped the fight. She ordered the golem to stop, and it immediately complied. This brought great relief to the adventurers because they truly thought they were about to die earlier. The butler expressed to Lady Adola that the two were merely B-rank adventurers, so success shouldn't have been expected. The two adventurers were irritated by this comment, and in their anger, they shouted at Lady Adola, asking why she would insult them when she couldn't even afford A-rank adventurers in the first place. One adventurer even went so far as to curse Adola's family and called it a fallen house. In response, Lady Adola had her golem escort the two out of her mansion. Afterward, Adola went to the large wall picture frame of her father to promise that she would reclaim the position of the royal family's wand and prove that she was the rightful heir. Adola also promised to use their family's magic to lead people to a better future. However, Adola suddenly became sad and annoyed because to fulfill her promise, she needed the help of an A-rank adventurer whom she couldn't afford. The butler mentioned to Adola that there was one more adventurer called for today. Adola commented that she was tired of watching B-rank adventurers who always fell and ran away like cowards. But the butler said that although the one coming later was also a B-rank adventurer, he was special because according to the letter from his guild, he had managed to climb to B-rank in just 6 months. He was their most promising rookie. But what they didn't know was that this man was already outside their gate now. Adola brushed her hair aside while doubting what her butler had said. But there was a shadow visible from outside the window, and it turned out to be the body of the golem that suddenly crashed through and destroyed the entire wall of windows. But we see that a male adventurer was holding this golem by the head. This greatly surprised Adola, and the male adventurer suddenly shouted at Adola to run because the golem was supposedly a kidnapper. While holding down the golem, the man said he couldn't understand what a golem was doing in their place. But Adola explained that it was hers, and she used it to test adventurers. The man couldn't believe what he heard, and Adola couldn't believe that this man was the adventurer the butler had mentioned earlier. Then the man suddenly mentioned that he remembered seeing something written about a golem in his quest application. Because of this, he realized that he had been under test this whole time. But Adola clarified that wasn't the case, and that the man had started the test on his own. Next, the man suddenly pulled out a mysterious high-tech wristband device and posed like a Power Ranger while chanting, "Bonso plate, set, transform." Adola was speechless at what she saw and wondered about the meaning of the man's strange incantation and where his unusual bracelet came from, especially since she could see the excitement on his face as he performed. But what was weirder was that Adola couldn't sense any magic from the man, so she was certain his bracelet wasn't a magic tool. She also couldn't understand what the man planned to do, especially given his extremely weird movements. And when the man shouted, "Bonso change," his outfit began to transform. While chanting his Warrior of Flames incantation, he completed his transformation as Kizuna Red. He was the Red Ranger who had been skied from the world where the Power Rangers came from. Kizuna Red's entrance was so powerful that his introduction even included an explosion behind him. This greatly shocked both Adola and her butler. Adola couldn't understand how the man had transformed without using any magic. She also wondered why there were so many explosions. Adola's heart was racing from what was happening, so she had to calm herself down. While Kizuna Red was giving the golem rapid kicks and punches, Adola noticed that he is the type of fighter who calmly analyzed unknown opponents. But when Red used his burning Kizuna punch, Adola cringed at the attack name. The golem exploded violently from the attack it received from Red, who had just finished a superhero landing. Adola couldn't understand where the explosion came from because she hadn't put any explosive substances in her golem. She also couldn't understand why Kizuna Red was wearing red from head to toe. The only thing she picked up from everything that happened was the cringeworthy name. Red transformed back to normal and asked Adola if he had passed her test. When Adola answered yes, Red jumped with joy. The adventurer introduced himself as Asagaki Tugo, but he preferred to be called by his nickname, Red. But Adola commented that what Red said was obvious because of the color of his outfit. Adola Avorn introduced herself in return and also introduced her butler, Poseidon. While the golem servants were repairing the broken window, Adola asked Red if it was okay to answer one question before she hired him. Red agreed and added another corny superhero line. Adola's vision darkened, and she asked Red about his skills, transformation, clothes, weird chant, bracelet, and why there were so many explosions whenever he transformed. Red was surprised by Adola's many questions, so Adola summarized all her questions into one. What are you? Adola gave an intense reaction when she learned that Red came from another world. Red wondered about Adola's reaction and asked himself if people like him were really that rare. Adola was convinced to believe Red because of the nature of his powers that didn't fit their world. But Adola also admitted to herself that it would be better for her if people like Red truly weren't normal in their world. In Adola's world, there were several historical books containing stories about people who came from different worlds, and some of the historical heroes who had been sealed away by the former Demon King were believed to be people who came from other worlds. Because of this, Adola still couldn't get over the fact that there was an otherworlder in front of her right now. She asked Red what was up with his weird red suit. Adola also wondered if all other otherworlders were like Red. Red was offended by the question, so he explained to Adola that in his world of origin, his suit was super popular among young people. But Adola was convinced that those young people had just been brainwashed. Adola then asked Red if they could move on and discuss the job offer once she believed he was truly an otherworlder. Red countered by asking if it was really that hard to believe he was popular among young people. Adola explained to Red that her job offer involved collecting mana metal from the ruins of Wakenark. Red asked what mana metal was. Poseidon explained to Red that mana metal was a rare crystal that had only recently been discovered after their planet's crust discharged mana, and this mana had enigmatically formed into crystal. Red commented that the description, enigmatically, was too vague. Adola became irritated at Red's comment, so she explained further that this was precisely why they were collecting it, to study it more thoroughly. Adola showed Red her alchemy table and explained that she planned to experiment with the uses of mana metal to see if it had practical applications in magic. She added that they also needed to immediately report to the royal family if they found that mana metal could be used for dangerous applications. This was the duty of members of the great wizard family like Adola herself. Red suddenly shouted in agreement. From his point of view, Adola was protecting the bond between magic and people. Adola confirmed that Red's point was somewhat correct. As Adola watched Red get excited about working, she thought to herself that what she was doing was important to regain her position as the royal family's wand. Therefore, She needed to obtain decisive results from her study of mana metal that she could show to a member of the royal family. To obtain the wand, getting results was extremely important for Adola. They didn't waste any time, and Adola immediately took Red to her wyvern, which they would use as transportation to Wakenark. According to Adola, her wyvern could take them there quickly because she could use both tamer-type magic and reinforcement magic. As long as no random monster encounters interrupted their journey, they would reach Wakenark in just half a day. Afterward, Red suddenly shouted, "Bonso change again." When Adola looked behind her, Red had suddenly transformed into his ranger form while chanting and creating an explosion behind him. Adola's face showed undisguised disappointment because Red had burned her entire lawn. But Red just said that if Adola was in a hurry with her mana metal research, he had a way to get them to their destination even faster than half a day. But according to Adola, they only needed to report quickly about their research, but that didn't mean they were in an extreme hurry. Then Red immediately pulled out a circular, weird-looking booster mechanism called the turbo engine. Adola was surprised about where it came from, so she pleaded with Red not to do weird things one after another because she felt like she was going crazy from everything that was happening. According to Adola, Red himself was harder to understand than mana metal. But it seemed Red wasn't listening well to what Adola was saying anymore. So he suddenly carried Adola by the waist and stepped onto the turbo engine platform. Adola wanted to ask for an explanation, but everything happened so quickly that she was shocked when they suddenly flew into the sky at rocket-like speed. They even passed a female beastman who was flying in the sky using a witch's broomstick. Poseidon had packed lunch for Adola, but the wyvern just licked it because they were already far away. And now, here we are at the ruins of Wakenark. The two arrived safely, but only Red was excited because Adola was feeling unwell and looked disheveled from the rapid succession of events. According to Red, their journey only took 2 hours because they didn't encounter any monsters along the way. But the truth, according to Adola, was that they had encountered 3 large flying monsters. However, they didn't feel it because they just passed through their bodies. Red remained excited about exploring the dungeon, so he immediately invited Adola to begin. But Adola pleaded for a moment to rest, especially since she was losing her sense of reality due to Red's actions. Either way, the two proceeded to enter the dungeon to explore. While they hadn't gone deep inside yet, they encountered monsters and were suddenly attacked by 3 trolls. Adola immediately used Ice Spear offensive magic, the Celsius Spike. Adola expected that the fight wouldn't be easy inside the high-ranked dungeon they had entered, which was full of high-level monsters. But her world crumbled again when she noticed that she was the only one struggling in the fight because she saw Red pull out yet another weapon. And Red was effortlessly slicing through the high-level monsters using it with his move called Handshake Caliber. Next, Red pulled out a handgun called Matchmaker Snipe, and he used it for his attack called Marriage Beam Gun, which managed to destroy multiple enemies. According to Adola, in the time it took her to defeat 1 enemy, Red had taken down numerous monsters. Adola had no idea what kind of weapon Red was using that was so bright and loud. After defeating the enemies, Red proudly created another powerful explosion, which greatly disappointed Adola because the explosion burned all the enemies' drop items. Returning to his non-ranger form, Red commented that the enemies they had just defeated were only about as strong as the small fries of the exterminator army. Adola asked Red what kind of monsters he had fought before to call these high-level monsters small fries. Red explained that the exterminators were a secret society that had planned to take over their entire world. Together with his teammates in Power Rangers Kizuna 5, they fought the forces of evil to protect people. Adola still didn't know what to think about what Red said about his world and their enemies. So, Adola just asked if it had been 6 months since that battle ended. In agreement, Red merely mentioned that he was worried about his teammates in Kizuna 5 whom he had left behind. Adola then asked that if Red was really worried about his teammates, was he looking for a way to return to his world? Red answered that of course that was the first thing he did, which was why he had traveled around Adola's world. He said he also enjoyed the adventure of journeying from the far east to the edge of the western lands. But during his journey, he realized that the Earth he came from was almost the same as the world he had arrived in. Both worlds were similar in having many people with problems who needed help. So, Red thought that just as he was chosen to become a Power Ranger in his world, there might also be a reason why he was sent to Adola's world. And until he found that reason, he wanted to stay. But either way, he really didn't know how to return to his world anyway. Red believed that if he just continued his adventure while helping people in need, he would eventually find the reason why he was here and the way to return to his world. Adola sighed because Red was so carefree about everything that was happening to him. Then Adola was greatly surprised when Red told her that she should be the one to talk about her dream. Adola complained because that wasn't part of their agreement. Red's eyes blazed with fire while forcing Adola to tell him her dreams and goals. But Adola just became uncomfortable and wondered why Red was so passionate about everything. Either way, Adola still told Red about her goal of restoring her family's position as the royal family's wand. Red asked what that was. Adola explained that the royal family's wand was the person entrusted with all magical matters, from researching it to managing its use. This was the title given to the top wizard who would serve the royal family, and members of House of Orn had held this position for many generations. House of Orn served well for the royal family and for the happiness of all people in the world. Adola had been extremely proud of her family since she was a child. But something happened 10 years ago. Adola's father lost in a duel where the appointment of the royal family's wand was based on the winner. Following this, Adola's entire family was exiled from the royal capital. The current royal family's wand is an evil wizard who has monopolized magic, making its use exclusive only to nobles and knights. They use war and all citizens as tools for their own greed, and Adola will never forgive them for their wickedness. What Adola wants to do is reclaim the role as the wand and use the power of magic to restore happiness to all people throughout the world. That was Adola's dream, and Red was speechless when he heard it. Then Adola became self-conscious, thinking her dream sounded childish. But instead of laughing at her, Red just shouted that he would never mock Adola's dream. Then Red suddenly approached Adola and held her hands while saying he had fallen in love. Adola was extremely surprised and blushed. Then Red suddenly said that putting smiles on people's faces across the world was the best goal anyone could dream of. Adola realized that Red had fallen in love with the spirit of her goal, not with her personally. Inside, Adola thought that whenever Red spoke to her, something strange happened to her heart. Then suddenly a skull fell from a pile of skulls, and Adola was frightened by it. She asked if these were the remains of dead adventurers. But Red didn't hear her as he was already excitedly shouting and calling Adola over. When Adola approached what Red was pointing at, they saw a tower-like collection of spikes that looked extremely strange. Red asked Adola if all of this was what she called mana metal. Red happily said that it looked like they would need to make many round trips to carry all the mana metal they had found. But Adola didn't share Red's joy because, according to her, it wasn't normal to see this kind of form of mana metal. Mana metal should look like a frozen water fountain due to the crystallization of mana discharged from the ground. But the mana metal here had been forcefully detached from the ground and scattered haphazardly. From its appearance, it seemed like someone had gathered a lot of mana metal and stored it here. While Adola was still observing the clusters, a powerful attack suddenly came from behind her. It came from a giant dragon monster that suddenly emerged from underground. Fortunately, Red managed to save Adola, but he was hit by the giant claw on his back and sustained a large wound. They rolled quickly from the impact's force and hit the wall. Red still couldn't stand because of this, while Adola couldn't believe that an ancient dragon was the beast said to live inside the ruins. Adola also wondered if this dragon itself was the one stockpiling the mana metal inside the ruins. Red suddenly stood up when he heard this and immediately activated his wristband device. Adola was shocked that Red still planned to fight after sustaining such a severe injury. Red reasoned that they needed to defeat the ancient dragon now, because if they didn't, they wouldn't be able to take home the mana metals they had found. But Adola just told Red not to be reckless because she would never allow anyone else to die just for her dreams. Adola just said they should escape and not anger the dragon further. But Red just got angry at what she said. Red reminded Adola that he had fallen in love with her dream. Red promised that Adola would achieve her dream one day to put smiles on everyone's faces. Adola suddenly became speechless at Red's words. Red now prepared his transformation sequence while saying that his duty was to protect Adola and her dreams. We hear again the chant that Red always recites, which now seemed to have a more serious, more heroic, and deeper meaning. And this was also what Adola felt as she witnessed Red's actions. And suddenly something emitted light beneath Adola. This turned out to be the transformation entrance explosion, and Adola was caught in it because she was behind Red during the transformation. Red checked on Adola, who seemed hurt from the explosion hitting her bottom. So Adola got angry because Red had just said he would protect her, but then suddenly made her explode. But Red had no time to apologize now, because he was facing the ancient dragon. The dragon attacked first with an extremely powerful giant left hook that destroyed the ground. But the two managed to escape and jumped upward using the turbo engine. However, Adola had no idea how Red would defeat the ancient dragon. Red said he had no choice but to use his strongest technique. Adola then said that if he had such a move, he should have used it from the beginning. While the two were still in the air, the ancient dragon breathed a powerful fire beam at them. And while blocking it, Red explained to Adola that to use this technique, he needed to have a partner with whom he had a strong bond. So Red asked for Adola's help. While Red was gliding in the air using the turbo engine platforms, Adola asked him if he was sure they had a strong bond even though they had only known each other for half a day. Red assured her that yes, they did, especially since they had already shared their hopes and dreams with each other and had traveled together. Red said that as long as it was the two of them, their friendship could overcome anything. Adola cringed because Red loved using the words friendship and bond so much. Adola just said she would help Red as long as it would save both of them. After all, she would burn anyway if she didn't. Red agreed and prepared for his next move. When Red shouted, "Come Kizuna Beast!" 5 robots suddenly appeared in the shapes of an eagle, gorilla, dolphin, T-Rex, and tiger. Then the 5 of them assembled together, while Red chanted his Power Ranger lines. And after the 5 robots combined, they created the Bonso formation where everything became one giant robot. And they called this the Maximum Kizuna Kaiser. Adola started drooling because her brain was fried. Her mind could no longer handle understanding everything that was happening. While the Kizuna Kaiser was beating up the ancient dragon, Red checked on Adola if she was okay because her way of speaking had changed. We can see inside the cockpit that Adola was indeed not herself. But because Adola asked Red what this giant robot was, Red still tried to explain that this was the miraculous formation of all the Kizuna beasts. And this was what they always used in the climax of every battle where everything was at stake. This was the strongest weapon of the Kizuna 5 that always won. But when the Kaiser suddenly received a powerful hit from the dragon, Adola loudly asked why they were losing now. Apparently, because only Red and Adola were inside the cockpit now, the Kaiser could only output 20% of its energy limit, and they only had 20 seconds left to move. Adola was irritated at how vague the Kaiser's forms of energy were. By the looks of things, it seemed they wouldn't be able to defeat the enemy, and they continued receiving hits. Red suddenly carried Adola and held her tightly while saying the fight wasn't over yet. Adola blushed and was surprised by this. Red chose to remain strong and continued believing they could win because of their bond. As long as they were together, Red believed they could protect the world's future, so they continued fighting the dragon while looking for an opportunity. And when the Kaiser and the dragon were locked in a grip, Red immediately used the exploding supernova of dreams. From the Kaiser's chest part, a large blaster fired an extremely powerful super beam, and the ancient dragon took the Maximum Kizuna blaster directly to the face. The entire top half of the ancient dragon was obliterated by the Kaiser's powerful blaster. The whole island where the battle took place shook from the blaster's power. Other people even saw the super beam from far-off places. Because of this, Red and Adola succeeded in their battle. But all Adola could think about now was how terrifying weapons from other worlds were. After several days, someone visited Red at his Adventurers Guild Hall. Red was surprised because Lady Adola herself was visiting him now, along with her butler Poseidon, whom he had thought was named Sebastian. Red asked Adola about her ongoing research on mana metal. Adola said there was some progress, albeit slow. Next, Red asked why Adola had visited him and if she had a new quest for him. But with a trembling voice, Adola said she had another reason for coming. Adola swallowed her fear and nervousness and told Red that she also planned to become an adventurer. And Adola's wish was to form a party with Red. Red was overjoyed and extremely excited. Red told Adola that he had wanted to join a party for a long time, but not a single adventurer wanted to team up with him, so he had been very worried. Adola wasn't surprised by what Red said because it was probably because he always burned the enemy's drop items. Red asked Adola why she suddenly thought of becoming an adventurer. Adola said it was because she needed to research Red's powers and needed to observe him carefully. Red was puzzled by what he heard. Red asked what Adola's research on his powers was for. Adola explained that she might be able to create a new type of magic if she combined Red's powers from another world with their current world's own magical powers. And one example of the new magic they could achieve would be interdimensional transfer magic. According to Adola, if she successfully created magic that could change the world, it would be easy for her to obtain the position as the wand. Adola added that she would not only be fulfilling her dream, but would also be able to help someone who was worried about how to return to their world of origin. Red's eyes widened at what he heard. Adola asked Red if he was okay because he had suddenly become quiet. Adola thought Red would immediately start talking about bonds and friendship again, but Red couldn't give an answer right away. But it turned out that Red was just so moved by Adola's words that he was almost crying, which was why he couldn't respond earlier. Red was absolutely convinced that meeting and getting to know Adola was his destiny. Adola was happy with the reaction Red gave, albeit very surprised as well. Red added that not a single person in Adola's world had offered to help him except for Adola herself. Poseidon noticed that Adola was blushing so much that her face had become as red as Red's clothes. And now it was Adola who couldn't speak. After becoming official party mates, Adola immediately began studying Red's transformation powers. Adola used her magic wand as a tongue depressor to examine what was inside Red's mouth. The spell Adola used also produced magic limbs, and she noticed that Red's body structure and appearance were no different from the bodies of people in this world. Red was attentive and compliant with Adola's procedures. But now Adola brought out an injection needle because she wanted to take Red's blood sample to study if his blood possessed any magical powers. The only thing different about Red's body compared to others was the absence of magic powers. So while Red was preparing to transform again, Adola approached him holding an injection needle. Red immediately started sweating and showed fear and nervousness because he apparently had a phobia of needles. Adola asked him if he was joking, because he was so cool when he was protecting her last time. Red explained that he was ready to receive injuries from battles, but injections were a different matter. Adola reminded Red of what he said before about doing everything to help her with her research. And while the two were arguing, the guild master scolded them because he saw them horsing around with Adola already on top of Red. So the guild master told them they should go home first if they wanted to fool around. The two had nothing to say, as if they were also surprised by what happened. This is the town where the guild hall of Red and Adola's new party stands. And for Adola to become an official adventurer, their guild master gave her a dog tag. Adola wondered what the item the guild master gave her was for, so Red explained that it was a status tag that proved she was an adventurer. Plus, it also showed her current status and skills. When they opened Adola's status tag, they saw for the first time that Adola's job class was Great Wizard, and her rank was rank E. Red was impressed because as a lady from House of Orn, it was only fitting that Adola had high stats in intelligence and spirit. Red praised Adola again because as the future wand of the royal family, it was only right that her job class title was Great Wizard. Adola was irritated because Red sounded like a fanboy simp. Next, Adola wanted to see what Red's status was. Red was surprised by her request. While Red was checking his status tag, Adola was thinking that even though they didn't know much about Red, his status tag might be able to read his power based on their world standards. And she might learn something from the data it would provide. So she asked Red for his status tag. But when Adola looked at it, she couldn't believe what she saw. Red's status tag displays weren't normal. The stats displayed were very different compared to what was normally shown for their adventurers. There was even an equipment section and customizable photo display that included a custom status message. It was so weird that we can't blame Adola for nearly going crazy and just cursing intensely because of Red's weirdness. Many questions were simultaneously swirling in Adola's mind, such as, Why were punching and kicking power displayed instead of strength stat like all adventurers? Why was there no level stat? What were the weight and height for? Why was there no skills section, and why was the name of his killer move so corny? And besides all those strange things, what was the relevance of the info about his status message and favorite pick? Adola just fell to her knees in disappointment because she was ready to see strange skills and intense stats. Red asked Adola if she was okay, and if she saw any problems with his status. But Adola just accepted that Red's format was really different because he simply didn't follow their world's norm. A moment later, some men suddenly approached the two. And they were the two B-rank adventurers who failed Adola's test a few days ago before she met Red. The knight asked what Adola was doing in their guild house and called her fallen house to recycle the insult he said to her last time. The swordsman gave Adola a threat. He said she shouldn't plan on entering as an adventurer like them after treating them both like idiots. Sadly, Adola couldn't recognize and remember them. So the two were even more offended because she had just forgotten them immediately. But Red remembered them as the two men who were supposedly kidnapped by Adola's golem. They became even more irritated by Red's reminder of that incident. Adola sincerely apologized to them both because she couldn't remember all the adventurers she saw. And in Adola's mind, she especially couldn't remember any other adventurers since meeting Red, who really stood out. The swordsman became irritated again because Adola's way of speaking still seemed arrogant. The knight expressed negative comments and gave advice to Red that he shouldn't party up with a trashy woman. Red suddenly shouted because of this and surprised them both. Red defended Adola and said he knew that sometimes Adola could be arrogant. Adola was irritated by Red's choice of words, so she asked him whose fault it was that she became like how he described her. Red just continued praising Adola and said she was a good person who even managed to develop new magic for him. Even if other people didn't like her attitude, that didn't mean she was a bad person like they thought. The two weren't convinced, and the knight even responded by saying that no matter what Red's reasons were, Adola could never become an adventurer. And this was because Adola was the daughter of the cowardly wizard, Howdy. The shock was visible on Adola's face while one of them pointed at her. Red wondered who the cowardly wizard they were referring to was. So when they learned that Red had no idea, they explained to him. The wizard who lost the duel for the seat as royal family's wand, and the wizard who was banished from the royal palace was Adola's own father, and he was known as the #1 coward in the entire country. Because of the knight's harsh words, something suddenly clicked in Adola's mind, and she went into a flashback where they had just been exiled with her father, along with their butler Poseidon. Adola's father spoke to her and said that even though they were no longer the wand of the royal family, their duty shouldn't change wherever they ended up. And that duty was to guide the hearts of all people toward the right direction using magic. Adola's father wanted them to continue bringing happiness and peace to the whole world, and they should be proud of that. The two adventurers continued insulting and said that if Adola became an adventurer too, she surely wouldn't complete any quest because she would just run away from everything like her coward father. Adola had enough of their harsh words, so her aura suddenly changed, and she demanded they take back what they said. Adola's eyes suddenly illuminated, and she said they knew nothing about her father and shouldn't insult him. The two suddenly became extremely frightened and were surprised by Adola's appearance. They sweated profusely and were very intimidated by Adola. As high rankers, they wondered why they were being opposed by a rookie. But Adola countered their insult and asked how they could call themselves high rankers when they couldn't even defeat her golem. As a final punchline, Adola said she would quickly surpass their rank because they were just third-rate adventurers. The two were so enraged they couldn't hold back anymore, so they challenged Adola to a fight. But before the trouble could escalate further, Red intervened between them to stop them from fighting. Red convinced them all that even though there were still bonds that could be gained from fighting, this wasn't the best way as fellow adventurers. It would be better for everyone if they just competed in a quest instead. So this was what Red suggested they do. And it looked like Red had chosen a quest from the quest board. Their guild master didn't stop them, so all four went straight to the quest location, which appeared to be a horror dark forest cave. Here, Red explained to everyone how they would conduct their contest in this quest. Their dungeon had a mysterious monster, and whoever defeated it first would be the winner. Adola said that if she and Red won, The two adventurers must apologize for the insults they said earlier about her father, and they must also promise never to repeat it. But if the two of them won, Idola would do whatever they wanted. The two agreed to the deal, and in their minds, they were overjoyed and confident they would win because they were very familiar with this dungeon from their daily hunting here. Their plan was to avoid all enemies and only hunt the main target. And they already knew exactly what they wanted to make Idola do when they won. The two would make sure Idola would regret saying she would do anything. Idola saw the two laughing and giving her evil smiles and looks. Idola was right in thinking they were confident because they were familiar with the place, but that wasn't why they were happy. Idola didn't know they were planning to make her strip naked. Idola knew that in terms of raw power alone, she and Red would win easily. But they still needed to do their best because they were at a disadvantage when it came to knowledge of the geography. Idola and Red immediately took action, so Red prepared to transform into Kizuna Red Ranger form. We can also see Idola immediately running away to one side. She already knew what would happen next because their duel had now begun after entering the first floor. And the knight and swordsman were also ready to follow their game plan of avoiding fighting the Minotaur because it was the strongest monster here. They also knew that Minotaurs were sensitive to loud sounds, so they needed to move quickly and quietly. But before the two could run far, Red had already transformed into his ranger form, and of course, it still came with loud chants and explosions behind him. The two were extremely shocked by what happened, not just because of the noise, but also because they couldn't understand where the explosions came from and the power Red displayed when he suddenly wore a red suit. Idola noticed that she could relate to their reaction because that was also what she felt when she first witnessed Red's crazy actions. Then suddenly the whole dungeon shook with accompanying loud rumbling sounds. The swordsman and the knight became extremely nervous because they knew what the shaking meant. Because of Red's loud explosion, numerous Minotaurs had emerged and immediately charged at all four of them from all directions. They now had no choice but to face the entire group of Minotaurs and fight for their survival. But while the three were clearly struggling, it was a different story for Red, who was casually flying upward using the turbo engine and using Formation Beta to deliver Kizuna turbo kicks to the enemies. The Minotaurs were easily being scattered everywhere from Red's attacks. Then Red boasted to his companions that he was used to being surrounded by many enemies. That was what the Kizuna Rangers experienced in their daily life. But Idola was just irritated by Red's arrogant comment and said that didn't mean his three companions were also used to this situation. While Idola was visibly struggling in the fight, she told Red that they should use the dual-ending robot thing they used last time to defeat the ancient dragon because the Maximum Kaiser could surely wipe out the Minotaurs. Red followed what Idola said, so he immediately called the Kizuna beasts to assemble. Here's the Maximum Kizuna Kaiser, ready for action. But after Red recited his chant, he couldn't do anything because the Kaiser couldn't move inside the cramped dungeon. So while he was stuck, the two adventurers and the enemy Minotaurs just stared at him. Only now did it sink in for Red that using Maximum Kizuna Kaiser inside the cave was a bad idea because it really couldn't move in such a tight space. Idola was irritated because she had really counted on the Kaiser, so she asked Red if he was joking. Idola still didn't want to come out of the cockpit, but Red was forcing her to continue fighting because there was no other way. The knight watched everything that happened and was okay because at least the robot had killed some enemies, but he still couldn't understand what happened and was going crazy like Idola before. Then he was suddenly shouted at by the swordsman because he was so distracted that he didn't notice there was already a Minotaur behind him about to hit him with a giant axe. And it looked like he had no time to react to it anymore. But just in time, Idola managed to cast a water magic spell, and using Undine's Scream, she managed to release water from underground with such strong pressure that it cut the Minotaur's body into pieces. The two couldn't believe that Idola had saved the knight's life, so the knight asked why she did it. Idola said she never wanted to save the life of anyone who disrespected her father. While continuing to fight the Minotaurs, Idola also started talking about her life. It was true that Idola's father lost his position and was exiled from the royal palace. But even though that happened and even though he continued to receive insults and disrespect from people, he remained diligent in his magic research to protect the smiles on people's faces until he died. Idola was dedicated to not letting the duty she inherited from her father be tarnished, so she could never allow anyone to die in front of her if she could save their life. Then Adola released an extremely powerful water magic like a tornado that managed to catch many minotaurs and threw them up to the ceiling, while Adola was saying she would never think twice about saving lives using her magic. And Adola added that this included extremely annoying people. The two adventurers had nothing to say about what they heard, but suddenly Adola added something more. She said she wouldn't want them to die without taking back their insults from earlier. The two suddenly became confused and didn't know what to feel. Adola only said that last part because she didn't want the two to think she might have a crush on them. Because of the spoiled moment, the two just said they couldn't see anything cute about Adola. Adola responded that she didn't need them to think she was cute. Red heard their conversation because he had just finished blowing up enemies behind him. Then he suddenly spoke and said that the description beauty suited Adola better than cute. Adola was surprised by what Red said and blushed intensely. Adola spoke stuttering after that, so Red couldn't understand her when she said that Red apparently had that kind of sensibility too. The knight became irritated because the two managed to flirt in the middle of an intense battle. Then suddenly the two's hair stood on end when they felt a sinister presence behind them. There was already a scary monster behind them that looked like the alien in Alien vs. Predator, but had a treasure chest held up above its head using its horns that were also made of limbs. They were all extremely shocked because it suddenly appeared out of nowhere. The swordsman and the knight backed away in fear and couldn't recognize who or what this monster was. The monster kept saying, "My treasure," as if it was looking for something. Then one of the adventurers asked if this was the mystery monster they were supposed to find from the quest. None of our four adventurers had seen this kind of monster before, and none of them remembered if there was such a monster that could be found in any records. While the mystery monster was slowly approaching, the remaining minotaurs also felt intense fear, so they all ran away. Next, Red played hero and stepped forward while making Adola step back because he didn't want her to get hurt. Red mentioned to Adola his hunch that the mystery monster they were facing now seemed like a secret society boss. Adola couldn't understand what Red was saying. The knight and the swordsman suddenly showed recklessness and charged at the mystery monster while asking Red and Adola if they had gotten cold feet because they suddenly became cowards. Then the swordsman reminded the two that whoever defeated this mystery monster would win their contest. But it seemed the two had aggravated the mystery monster too much, causing it to shout loudly, "My treasure is mine." And in an instant, the mystery monster suddenly counterattacked with such speed and power that the two's weapons were instantly destroyed. After Red sensed that the two were in a dangerous situation, he suddenly vanished from in front of Adola. The two adventurers had no choice but to try to block the incoming left punch from the mystery monster who was angrily saying they were thieves. But fortunately, before the monster's hit could land, Red hit it first with an extremely powerful straight right punch. The force of Red's punch was so strong that the two were thrown back by the aftershock. Then Red's right hand and arm trembled in pain because what he had punched was extremely hard. Red had knocked down the mystery monster with the force of his punch, and from the air, Red managed to backflip away from the enemy. Red's right arm was still hurting and trembling, and he said that because of how hard what he punched was, he remembered one of his previous opponents from his world, the Rejection Ender. Adola told Red she had many questions for him now, but first she wanted to know if Red had any counter to this kind of enemy. And in response to the question, Red brought out a large heavy gun called the Victory Kizuna Buster. Once again, Adola was surprised and commented because there was yet another large random thing that suddenly appeared out of nowhere. Red explained that this weapon gathered Kizuna energy from combining the hearts of each user, and right now, this was the strongest weapon they could use. Adola suddenly questioned the meaning of combining hearts, because she seemed to have an idea of what that meant. Red approached the swordsman and the knight, and even managed to pose while asking for their help. Adola told Red that it was unlikely the two would cooperate with them. But Adola's assumption was wrong because even though the two didn't understand what weapon they would use, they agreed to help, as long as Red wouldn't deceive them. Adola was surprised because she hadn't expected the two would be easy to talk to. While smiling, the mystery monster sat in a corner. The swordsman said he regretted that they couldn't continue their duel contest, but he was more worried about letting the mystery monster remain in their favorite hunting grounds. Red suddenly approached Adola very closely and asked if she approved of the two helping. Adola blushed and agreed because they had no choice. The four immediately joined together to hit the mystery monster with a powerful attack. After Red recited his chant about their bonds, the Victory Kizuna Buster fired a powerful V-shaped projectile, but it was hard to tell if it hit the mystery monster. Adola asked if victory was what the V-shape fired by their gun symbolized, but the swordsman and knight clarified that wasn't the case because they had failed. It seemed their shot had no effect on the mystery monster because it quickly got close to them to deliver a powerful left punch to the knight and the swordsman. But Red quickly ran in front of the two to block the punch and save them. Red explained that because everyone still wasn't on good terms, their Kizuna energies rejected each other, which was why the beam split in the middle when they fired earlier. He said that was also what Red experienced before when Blue and Yellow had an intense argument. Adola complained about why they had to rely on an unstable system in their fight. Red was still blocking the mystery monster's fist but admitted he was struggling because he was weakening from using up his strength, summoning the Kizuna Kaiser and Kizuna Buster earlier. Because of this, he was finally hit by the mystery monster's attack and was thrown far, exploding from the impact against the wall. Adola was extremely worried about Red. Red had lost his ranger form, and before he lost consciousness, he just told Adola to escape with the others. But Adola didn't follow this because she planned to help Red using her recovery magic. But it seemed Adola wouldn't make it because the mystery monster had quickly approached her and was about to hit her with its large claws. But the monster suddenly backed away because the knight and swordsman pushed it to save Adola and Red. Adola was surprised and asked what they were doing. The knight said he was just returning the favor for saving their lives earlier. And the swordsman said that although it was hard to admit, they knew they couldn't defeat the enemy with just the two of them. While Adola was still healing Red, the two said they knew that to defeat the mystery monster, they needed someone like Red who possessed powers they couldn't understand. So while the two were doing everything they could to stop the monster, they told Adola to hurry with healing Red because they would do everything even just for a small chance of winning. Then the knight mentioned Adola calling them third-rate adventurers earlier and just expressed his resentment about that. He revealed to Adola that life hadn't been easy for both of them just to pursue climbing up to B rank. Because of this, Adola suddenly remembered the insults she had thrown earlier at their guild hall. Adola had no idea that what she had said to the two adventurers had also hurt them deeply. Even though she had only said that because they shouldn't have insulted her father, she realized she was no different from them in making wrong and unfair judgments. Then bright particles could be seen coming out from Adola's aura going to Red's bracelet device. However, the mystery monster was now extremely angry, and the two adventurers could no longer stop its charge and attack on Red and Adola. And when it was about to grab them, Red's bracelet device suddenly rotated as if something had activated it. The knight and swordsman were extremely nervous with worry because they couldn't stand anymore and could only watch their companions in danger. But they just hadn't immediately noticed that Red had suddenly regained consciousness and managed to stop the mystery monster's hand with his own fist. And he managed to do this using just his non-ranger form. While carrying Adola in his arm, he said he had felt something. Then Red suddenly released an extremely powerful force from his right hand that managed to send the monster flying far away. Next, Red explained that he felt the grudges between Adola and their two companions had disappeared. According to Red, they now had the breath of a new bond. The shock and blush on Adola's face were clearly visible because of what happened. And of course, also because Red was holding her tightly. Red managed to transform into his ranger form again. But now, just as he was saying burn fiercely, his fist was literally blazing as well. While reciting his transformation chant again, there was an explosion behind him that was even more intensified than his normal one. Adola could strongly feel the fresh heroism that this more intense version of Kizuna Red now carried. Red again asked for everyone's help to try what they did earlier against the mystery monster. But there was a big difference now because they no longer had ill feelings toward each other. And you could see in their eyes that they were determined to unite to defeat their common enemy. After reciting the chant, their weapon fired a fire beam so powerful it destroyed the ground they were standing on. The pure victory Kizuna Buster obliterated the mystery monster, and their mysterious attack even had an after image of the letter V. After this, There was one final explosion before the battle ended where they all said, "Our bonds have prevailed." And we can see the four adventurers posing exactly like the pose of the Kizuna Five. It seemed they couldn't control themselves when they suddenly posed like this. So Adola and their two companions were wondering how and when they had learned to pose like this. Before they went home, Red first put Adola's fallen wizard hat back on her while Adola was thinking about what kind of monster they had fought. Then suddenly a bald old man appeared from the burned corpse of the mystery monster, and he was unconscious. They wondered if he had come from inside the monster, or if maybe he was the monster's item drop. But because the bald man was severely injured, Adola decided to take him back to their guild house. Red carried the bald man on his back and noticed there was a strange mark on the old man's forehead. That evening, the four had returned to the guild house, and the two said goodbye to their rookies. Adola and Red were also happy to say goodbye to their seniors. But before the two left, they made some jokes first. The knight said Adola wasn't really a cute junior, and the swordsman said Adola should make sure she wouldn't run out of love for Red. Adola retorted and said if they didn't leave immediately, she would hurt them both 100 times worse than the wounds she had treated. While walking in the lobby, Red told Adola he was happy because they had gained new friends who were good adventurers. Adola said she wasn't sure if she would call them good, but she had managed to change her first impressions of people she didn't like at first. She said she wasn't normally like that, but she also hadn't expected that it wasn't bad to change one's mind about someone you dislike. Red was so happy that he said just as he expected, anyone could challenge anything, even things they hate. Adola commented with a smile because she had expected Red would say something like what he just said. So next, Adola happily brought out her injection and told Red that just as he said, maybe he would like to face and challenge something he hates, like needles. Red couldn't say anything while Adola was approaching him holding an injection, so he just prepared his transformation. From outside the guild house, their shouting could be heard. Adola reasoned that Red needed to face the needle challenge to grow. But Red was making excuses and said what he was talking about earlier was different. Then when he shouted Bonso change, something suddenly exploded inside the guild house, so their guild master got angry and said if they wanted to do what they were doing, they should do it outside. Meanwhile, we can see that there was no longer anyone lying on the bed where they had put the bald old man they rescued to sleep, and it looked like he had gone through the window to get out. The bald man was walking on the street and speaking with a voice as deep as the mystery monster's, and it looked like he was searching for his treasure, but we know it had been burned along with the mystery monster using the Kizuna Buster. Then suddenly an alien-like tongue came out from his mouth and his head changed shape while a mouth appeared where the mark on his forehead was. A girl and a man, both reporting to a man named Noisel, saw this happening. The mystery monster's transformation process was very creepy, and after just a few bone cracks, it had fully transformed again. But the man and the girl with him immediately confronted it. The man even asked where it planned to go. But this monster really had no remaining ounce of humanity, and it can only speak words about its treasure. But in the blink of an eye, it suddenly received an intense slash from the man. One slash was all it took to bring down this monster. Then the monster returned to human form again, and the man approached the parasite alien monster living in the person's forehead. He called it a dangerous seed, and using special release magic, he removed it permanently. The man and the girl walked away and just left the man trembling on the street with a large hole in his forehead. Then the girl said it seemed that being just the two of them just wouldn't suffice in order to save this world. After some time, the party of Adola and Red have finally come home to the Avorn family estate. Adola looked exhausted and stressed while Red was happy and energetic. He got Poseidon's name wrong again, calling him Terriston, and he also apologized for his sudden arrival. Poseidon gave Lady Adola a warm welcome and corrected Red about his name. Next, he asked Red what his purpose was for visiting. Red suddenly answered that he would be living here from now on, and Poseidon's world darkened when he heard that. Poseidon immediately ran to Adola's quarters to confirm from her if it was true that Red planned to live here in their house. While undressing her coat, Adola explained the reason. The idiot Red had been failing his quests so frequently that he had no money now. And one of the reasons why this happened was that he always burned the collectible materials they got from battles. Fortunately, they had many vacant rooms in their mansion, And Adola also thought of hitting two birds with one stone because if Red lived here with them, it would be easier for Adola to continue her research about Red's world. Poseidon wasn't convinced to be comfortable with Adola's decision because of the fact that Red was a man. Adola reasoned that she and Poseidon had been living by themselves for a long time anyway. But Poseidon reasoned that was because he had been serving as their family's butler for a long time, and in his eyes, Adola was like his own granddaughter. Poseidon added that Red was just a young man and was surely at the peak of his sexual desires. Poseidon was worried that Red might suddenly lose control one day and take advantage of Adola's voluptuous body. Adola suddenly became awkward, so she told Poseidon not to describe his granddaughter as voluptuous. Then Adola thought about Red and what Red had said to her before about how the word beauty suited her better than cute. Because of this, Adola first thought that Red wasn't the type of man Poseidon was talking about. But she also thought again that maybe Poseidon was right because technically, Red had called Adola beautiful. While Red was looking at Adola's father's wall picture frame, he noticed they had similar eyebrows. And Poseidon returned to talk to him here as their new housemate. Poseidon apologized to Red because he had something he wanted to request from him. Red cheerfully agreed and said, "When in Rome, do as the Romans do." So Poseidon should just request whatever he wanted, and Red would give it. After Red agreed, Poseidon suddenly brought out large scissors, and his world darkened again while Poseidon was saying he wanted to cut off Red's balls. Red was suddenly shocked by this and couldn't understand how they got to this situation. According to Poseidon, this was for his duty to protect Adola's purity as her butler. But Adola heard the noise of their struggle, so she immediately went down and asked Poseidon what he was doing to Red. Red shouted and asked Adola for help because the scissors were about to touch his balls. Then suddenly two visitors entered through the house door. The woman said they let themselves in because they had been pressing the doorbell for a while and no one was opening it for them. But because they suddenly entered, they caught Poseidon candid with scissors in hand and Adola mounted on top of Red, both sweating. The man's eyes darkened and the woman stared at Adola. Then the woman suddenly smiled and said that Adola was enthusiastic even in the afternoon. Adola told Teltina that as a lady, she shouldn't speak using those kinds of phrases. After a while, we can see that Adola had punished Poseidon by making him clean outside in the courtyard. Meanwhile, Red was surprised that their female visitor was actually a literal princess. They are now talking in the living room where the woman introduced herself as Teltina Lizwagre Avalost, the third princess of the Avalost Empire. She also introduced the man with her as her attendant, the hero Rosie Mist. Then Rosie suddenly unsheathed his sword and said that Adola and Red must pay with death for their sins against Teltina for displaying immoral acts in front of her earlier. But Teltina stopped Rosie because she said it was too early to carry out a death sentence. Then she gave Rosie a smack on the head and scolded him that it wasn't Adola and Red's fault because they were the ones who suddenly entered. Adola still tried to explain that they were really misunderstanding what they saw earlier. While making puppy dog eyes, Teltina pointed out to Rosie that he should be more kind and more tolerant of people, especially if Rosie's desire was to become a beloved hero of the people. Then the room suddenly filled with roses when Rosie said that the only love he needed was from Teltina, even if the masses didn't love him. As long as Teltina loved him, he would become a hero who could kill anything and anyone. From Teltina's blush, it couldn't be denied that she had feelings for Rosie. It was just extremely awkward for Red and Adola to see this. Then Red suddenly laughed and said they were a strange kind of couple. Adola's face was indescribable as she looked at Red. Now that everyone was calm, Teltina began explaining the reason for their visit. Teltina was here to ask for Adola's help in analyzing and retrieving the magic item inside the bottle jar she presented. Adola recognized it as the pimple that came from the bald old man they had encountered in the dungeon. Teltina wondered why Adola called it a pimple and asked Adola if she wasn't familiar with it. So Adola told Teltina that she had seen something like that pop out from an old man's forehead after they defeated the mystery monster yesterday. When she heard this, Teltina asked if she was the first to defeat that monster. Adola answered that she wasn't the one who defeated it, but Red. Red suddenly interjected and said that what defeated the monster was their bonds giving a shot using the Victory Kizuna Buster. Teltina wondered what Victory Kizuna Red was talking about. She asked if that was the name of a spell. But we can see that Rosie suddenly became angry and unsheathed his sword again. He was scolding Red that he shouldn't speak to Teltina so casually. Then Adola was also getting extremely angry at Red, so she told him to just be quiet because things became even harder to explain when he spoke. But instead of being offended, Teltina was delighted and extremely impressed with Adola. She thought Adola had invented new magic that could defeat such a powerful monster. Red and Adola were speechless at what Teltina said. Now Teltina showed Adola the magic item again and said that if she entrusted it to Adola, she was sure she would unravel the mystery behind this seed of magic. Adola asked what the seed of magic was. Teltina explained that the seed of magic was a seed that, when implanted in a person, intensely amplified their magic power. The person gained special magic that could grant their wishes, and they called this privilege-type magic. Adola still couldn't quite grasp the concept of magic that could grant wishes, so they asked what the difference was between that magic compared to normal magic. Teltina gave some examples. If the magic seed went to a person who really wanted gold that they shouldn't be able to get, the magic seed would give them the ability to turn anything they touched into gold. If it went to someone who wanted to protect their treasures, it would give them the ability to create a barrier up to 30 kilometers wide. The thing is, this power was extremely easy to obtain. All that was needed was to affix the magic seed properly to a host. According to Adola, it wasn't normal for someone who hadn't practiced magic for a long time to be able to perform high-level magic. So if everything about the seed of magic was true, this would be a groundbreaking magical tool. But Teltina had a bad feeling about this because she believed that all amazing things always had their own equivalent dark side. She explained that the seed of magic also had a dark side effect. Once the seed developed and surpassed its host's power, it would suddenly take over the host's body and transform them into frightening monsters. Only now did Red and Adola realize that the bald old man they had seen in the dungeon had been possessed by a magic seed. Because of what they now knew, Adola asked that if the royal family knew the seed of magic was dangerous, why hadn't it been banned yet? Teltina suddenly found it difficult to answer their question. And this was because it was hard to say that in this case, there was a high chance that the current royal family's wand, Xiaohe, was involved. Adola was extremely shocked when she heard the mention of the royal family's wand's name. Teltina said that she didn't have solid proof if Xiaohe was really involved, but she was sure that the seed of magic was already in trade circulation and its price was extremely high, making it prominent in the high-price market and amongst the nobles. Teltina was also sure that the wand knew everything about this. And besides that, because Xiaohe had authority over all magical tools in the entire country, they had the means to create special-type magical equipment like this seed. Red suggested they should take action now and stop them, but according to Teltina, it wasn't that easy. Xiaohe was the type of wizard who received a lot of support from nobles and royals. If someone like Teltina who had a weak level of influence interfered in their affairs, they could easily dispose of her. And besides this problem, more and more nobles were getting drunk on unnatural power. They abused this power, and because of that, many people's lives were being ruined. Then Teltina's eyes suddenly looked like dragon eyes when she said she wanted to stop this no matter what happened, even if she needed to wage war against Xiaohe and the royal nobles. This was why Teltina needed Adola's power. Teltina extended her hand to Adola because she was asking for help from a great wizard who could surpass Xiaohe, because Adola was the daughter of the former wand of the royal family. Adola accepted Teltina's hand and request because as the head of House of Orn, she couldn't just let such severe abuse of magic continue. They were both happy to join forces to fight their common enemies. The intense gratitude Teltina had for Adola was visible in her smile. And it was also visible in Adola's smile that she had an ulterior motive in accepting the quest. Because of this, she wouldn't just be able to destroy Xiaohe, she could also win over the royal family. So in her mind, she was jumping with extreme joy. But she told herself that, of course, her end goal was still to stop evil. Adola was just really excited because her dreams were finally progressing. Then the moment between the two was ruined when Red suddenly spoke again and said he wanted to help them because he didn't want to just sit on the sidelines while the world needed help. Adola said she had expected Red to say something like that. Teltina was happy to accept Red's help because she only had a few allies anyway, but Rosie hadn't agreed yet. Then Rosie suddenly pointed his sword close to Red. He said he couldn't allow a rude man like Red to join Teltina's adventure. Red wondered why Rosie wouldn't allow it. Adola told him that it was really his fault because he always spoke nonsense. Then Teltina sweetly told Rosie to be honest about what he really wanted to say. Because of this, Rosie suddenly shouted aggressively and said he just really didn't want anyone to disturb his journey with Teltina. Teltina awkwardly thanked Rosie for his honesty. Rosie believed that as Teltina's sword, he was more than enough to help Teltina. Red now understood that Rosie thought he would just be a burden on their journey. Then Adola chimed in and said that besides being a burden, he was also always impolite. Because of this, Red challenged Rosie to give him a chance to prove to him and show him his power that Red said they would need. Rosie got angry at his remark and said not to be cocky because he would show Red that he only needed one finger to defeat the likes of Red. They took their sparring match outside, far from the House of Orn estate. Teltina worried and asked Adola if it was okay to continue this. Adola wondered why that was Teltina's question to her. Teltina explained that Rosie was a former S-rank hero known as the Demon Swordsman, and this was because he had already taken down many high bounty targets in his career. Besides this, the sword he used was the very historical sword used by the hero who sealed the Demon King in the past. And this was the sacred treasure of legends, the royal family's holy sword. In other words, Rosie was the strongest swordsman who wielded one of the strongest swords in the world. The truth was that only a few people in the world could defeat Rosie. Then Adola emphasized Teltina's description in this world, because we know that Red wasn't from this world. While transforming, Red mentioned to Rosie his condition if he won. Rosie would just let him work with Teltina. Rosie answered that he was a bastard because of his rude way of talking to Teltina. So Rosie's condition if he won was that Red should never show himself in front of him and Teltina ever again. Their man versus man duel began, and before transforming, Red said that a man doesn't go back on his word. After Red's transformation, Rosie's sword immediately clashed with his arm. Rosie commented on Red's explosions and his eccentric costume. Rosie even asked if Red was a clown. Adola was shocked because Rosie didn't even flinch when he witnessed Red's crazy actions for the first time. Teltina excitedly asked Adola what kind of magic Red was using. Adola said it wasn't magic. But in Adola's mind, she was also surprised because Teltina wasn't shocked when she saw Red's transformation. Even Adola herself was still a little surprised until now. So far, there was no clear winner in Rosie and Red's duel. No one had delivered a powerful blow yet, because there was still just clashing happening. After a strong clash, they moved away from each other first. According to Red, Rosie was a strong opponent. At first, he seemed as strong as the top brass of the Enders, but the truth was Rosie was even stronger than them. Rosie admitted that Red knew how to fight and could keep up with him. Because of this, Rosie brought out his true power, the sacred sword's second form, Dragloss. Rosie's sword changed form and became an elaborate greatsword that emitted a powerful smoky aura. Only now did Adola learn that Rosie's sword could change shape and element. Red was delighted and said Rosie's sword was cool, and he answered Rosie's move by showing his own true strength. When Red said, "I'll go all out too," Adola suddenly became stressed because she already knew what Red planned to do. He brought out the Kizuna beasts, and in an instant, their duel became 6 versus 1. Rosie was extremely shocked by what happened and couldn't believe Red could bring out 5 large golem-type beasts. Then Red said that to forge new bonds, he needed to go full throttle without holding back. When Red shouted, "Bonso formation," the Kizuna beasts assembled into Maximum Kizuna Kaiser. A giant robot was now facing Rosie, who looked extremely tiny in comparison. He couldn't believe what he was facing now, and seemed to be going crazy from what was happening. This was how Red and Rosie's duel looked now, like a person versus an ant. Adola, who was inside the cockpit with Red, commented that the power Red displayed was too over the top just to fight one person. Red agreed that he got carried away, so he was thinking about what his next move should be. But it seemed Red had unintentionally included Teltina inside the cockpit, who was now extremely amazed at what she witnessed. Adola was surprised because it wasn't in their plan to include Teltina inside the cockpit. Adola asked Red if she understood correctly that they needed to have bonds of friendship first before someone could join inside the cockpit. so it should be impossible for Teltina to join because she and Red hadn't even talked much yet. But Red disagreed with what Adola said about Teltina, who was now happily looking out the window. According to Red, Teltina had already introduced herself to them and had told them her goals, and they all understood each other. That alone could already be called bonds. Then Adola suddenly admitted to Red that she had been thinking for a long time that there seemed to be a lot of loopholes in his Kizuna system. Then Rosie was extremely surprised when he heard Teltina call him from inside the towering robot above. Rosie became extremely angry because he thought Red had planned to take Teltina as a hostage. Red tried to explain, but Rosie couldn't hear him anymore as his intense rage couldn't be calmed down, which he also used to charge at the Kaiser. Rosie displayed such intense power that he managed to fly using the force coming out from his sword. In Rosie's extreme anger, his eyes had turned pale, and he managed to hit the Kaiser with his sword with tremendous force. Those inside the cockpit felt this, and Red and Adola couldn't believe that Rosie managed to push the Kaiser backward. Red tried to fight Rosie, but couldn't hit him because he was too small for the Kaiser to fight. Then Adola mentioned that Red's Kaiser was useless because it could only fight opponents of its size, and it was also too bulky. After Rosie managed to maneuver, he was now ready to rescue Teltina, so he told her he was coming. Then Red was even pleased with what he heard and commended the bond between Rosie and Teltina. So Red called out to Rosie and said this made him want to travel with them even more. Then Red brought out the great Kizuna sword. But Rosie still showed no fear, still full of confidence and rage, asking if Red really believed he could hit him with a giant sword. Red answered that he knew he couldn't. So, his plan was to use the great Kizuna sword like a giant fan to blow Rosie away with extremely strong wind. The wind was so strong that Rosie's skin nearly separated from his face when it hit him. Then Rosie was thrown into the sky so fast and so far that you could see something like a star suddenly sparkle in the morning sky with an accompanying ting sound. Adola suddenly turned pale and Teltina screamed because of what happened. That could have killed Rosie. They immediately flew to the trajectory where Rosie landed, and they saw he had safely landed on top of a leafy tree. Rosie was still alive, but was still having difficulty breathing. But he still managed to speak and told Teltina with intense emphasis that he wouldn't allow Red to travel with them. Red was disappointed when he heard this, but Adola told him that was expected after what Red had done to him. But Teltina reminded Rosie that he had promised to let Red join them if he won the fight. Rosie still wasn't convinced, so Teltina gave another perspective. With a frightening look, Teltina said that a person with tremendous power would be even more dangerous than the seeds of magic if they just let him do what he wanted. Adola and Rosie agreed with that fact. Finally, Rosie also understood that Teltina's mind would be more at ease if they took Red as an ally. So when Rosie accepted that they had no choice, he called Red by his name, Asagaki Tugo. Now Red was officially allowed to travel with Teltina, even though Rosie had no plans to get along with him or get used to his company. In response, Red just laughed. So while performing recovery magic on Rosie, Adola asked what was funny. Red said that not a single person who had said the words Rosie just said hadn't become a close friend. The next day, Adola said goodbye to Poseidon and entrusted her estate to him. Poseidon was happy and proud to see the formerly shut-in Adola leaving alone for an adventure. When the four of them had left, Adola mentioned to Red that it seemed he wouldn't need to live in their house anymore. So he didn't need to get castrated by Poseidon anymore. Red suddenly became traumatized by remembering what happened and suddenly grabbed his balls, while Teltina was wondering what was going on. Teltina brought out a map so the four of them could know where they planned to go. Teltina's map had marks indicating possible locations where feudal lords might be hiding seeds of magic. And the town of Acarina was closest to their current location, so that's where Teltina planned to go first. Red got too excited, so in his enthusiasm, he declared they were determined to go to Acarina. Rosie got irritated with him because he shouldn't speak as if he was the one deciding. So Rosie poked Asagaki Tugo's cheek with his scabbard. Afterward, Red told Rosie he wanted him to stop calling him by his full name. Rosie still refused, so Red added that even Teltina was already calling him by his nickname, Red. Teltina agreed. It was Teltina's first time calling a gentleman by his nickname, and Rosie became extremely angry at Red because of this. He became intensely jealous because even he had never been called by his nickname by Teltina. Adola was happy watching her new party mates bonding. Then Red said he would start calling him by his nickname, and he used Rokuin. Rosie didn't like this. In the end, Adola mentioned to Teltina that truthfully, she was worried about this kind of party lineup. Before long, our party arrived at Akarina, the busy city. This was the first mission of the newly formed party in a place where many different jobs and races come and go. It was full of adventurers and merchants, and there were also many poor and wealthy people here. As soon as they arrived, Teltina immediately sensed something worrying. According to her, the town's atmosphere now was very different compared to what she had heard about it. Then we can see a mysterious person observing the party like a ninja from a dark corner. Then someone suddenly got startled and screamed when Red asked if he could ask about their town's feudal lord. The person just ran away from Red, and when he asked others, they just said they didn't know anything, then went inside their houses and closed their doors. Red was dumbfounded when he realized that not a single person in the city wanted to talk about their feudal lord. Red shouted at the challenge's difficulty, but still didn't want to give up and assured that he would also make bonds with the people of Akarina. Adola was disappointed in Red and asked if he had already forgotten their objectives. Adola reminded him that they were here to get information about the magic seeds. Rosie mentioned that the people's behavior wasn't normal because they were clearly afraid to speak about their feudal lord. Teltina said that something seemed abnormal about their feudal lord and he might be scary, which was why his citizens were so anxious. Then suddenly someone called out to them out of nowhere. It was the ninja person who had been observing them since their arrival, and he told the party they should avoid the feudal lord of Akarina. But even though the ninja person had just said to avoid the feudal lord, Red still asked him about it. So the ninja person said their questions to him and to the people of Akarina were useless, because Akarina's law forbade all people from discussing the feudal lord. Then before leaving them, he said it would be better for them to leave the city as soon as possible. Teltina wondered if there was a severe punishment for disobeying this law. Red suddenly spoke again, stating the obvious, that the residents were afraid of being punished so they wouldn't speak. Teltina wondered if they might still get away with it if no one saw them outsiders talking to a resident. Then Adola said she thought a magic field was the real reason why the residents were afraid. Red was surprised by what she said. Teltina asked about the magic field, so Adola explained that she could feel an unsettling magic power surrounding the entire city. So the government was likely monitoring the whole city using a magic field. Red was surprised to learn they could do that using magic, but Adola said that even expert wizards couldn't create magic that could surveil an entire city. So it was likely a privilege-type magic used by the feudal lord. Teltina asked Adola if she was sure the feudal lord was involved in using magic seeds. But Adola answered that she still wasn't sure, but she was sure that at the very least, the feudal lord had evil intentions. After Adola spoke about the feudal lord's evil intentions, she suddenly heard a voice saying, "Do not speak ill of the feudal lord." Then an executioner monster suddenly appeared behind Adola and immediately attacked. But fortunately, Adola managed to jump away from its horizontal slash. The executioner monster immediately followed up with a vertical slash. But fortunately, Red quickly saved Adola. After Red let go of her, you could see that she wasn't feeling well because of what happened, and Red couldn't understand what their enemy was now. Adola realized that besides surveillance monitoring magic, there was also another type of magic included in the privilege-type magic used by the feudal lord. An invisible presence heard Adola, so it suddenly spoke and underwent transformation magic that looked like a whirlwind. The party asked if it was him, and when the whirlwind cleared, an old man appeared wearing royal robes and had two executioner monsters behind him as bodyguards. He introduced himself as Lurgwat, the feudal lord of Akarina. He bowed his head and said he was the protector of the city's order and tranquil. Now they had seen the feudal lord himself, and Red wondered because he hadn't expected him to look softer and gentler. Princess Teltina immediately addressed Lord Lurgwat. Teltina first introduced herself as the third princess of the Avalost Empire. Then she immediately accused Lurgwat of oppressing people using magic and said she couldn't tolerate this. So Teltina immediately ordered the feudal lord to destroy the magic seeds right now. Red and Adola were shocked by Teltina's authoritative speech, while Rosie applauded the beauty of her words. But the two executioner monsters behind the feudal lord suddenly showed their bravery. The feudal lord questioned the accusation of him oppressing people. Then he just raised his hands and said all he was doing was upholding order and peace in this lawless city. Red angrily asked him what kind of order he was talking about when all he did was threaten his people. The feudal lord answered that he wasn't giving threats but guidance. Red was puzzled by the feudal lord's answer. Then the feudal lord further explained that most people in Ocarina City were stray sheep who failed to reach paradise. The feudal lord's method of guidance was to spread thorns along the sides so people wouldn't take the wrong path where thorns blocked the way. Red challenged the feudal lord's idea about thorns and told him to look around and observe that his people were so afraid of his thorns that they had all stopped walking. Then Red pointed out to the feudal lord that if he really wanted to guide them on the right path, he should hold their hands and walk with them. The feudal lord's eyes widened at what he heard from Red. Then Teltina was about to add points to what Red was saying, but she stopped when the feudal lord suddenly told them they didn't know how modest and healthy his people who followed his laws were. And with a sinister smile and tone, he asked the party if this wasn't the paradise that all people were chasing. Red began transforming into his ranger form while saying he now understood the feudal lord. The feudal lord didn't want to create a paradise but a miniature garden where everyone followed his wishes. Then we can see that the feudal lord indeed had a magic seed that had entered his left hand. He said it was really pitiful how young people's thinking was so shallow that they couldn't understand the true principle of Ocarina City. Then suddenly an executioner monster appeared behind Red, ready to attack immediately. Red managed to counterattack and kick it while shouting at the feudal lord that he had no desire to understand his principle. And while Red's kicking motion wasn't even finished yet, another one suddenly appeared behind him. This monster immediately hit him in the back, and he had no time to react anymore. Then another one appeared behind him while he was still flying from the hit he received. He was hit in the back by the monster again, and this just kept happening continuously, so he couldn't do anything and couldn't fight back. In analyzing what was happening, Adola thought that the feudal lord's privilege-type magic might be a compound magic. One part was covering the entire city with magic power to detect those who disobeyed the law, and another part was summoning familiars to pass judgment and punishment on people who broke the law. This was Adola's understanding now of how it worked. Whoever disrupted the order established by the feudal lord would immediately be sent to judgment until the entire city achieved tranquility. Adola also figured out that the feudal lord's territorial magic could recognize Red's blind spots and could also summon familiars repeatedly to attack him repeatedly in these blind spots. Besides this, Adola also noticed that the feudal lord had an abnormal amount of mana, which was why he could keep summoning familiars repeatedly without running out of magic power. He also had a complex technique to control his own mana. So this was how overpowered magic seed and privilege-type magic really were. Teltina pleaded with Rosie to help Red in the fight, but Rosie just said that if he fought too, he would get beaten up just like Red. It would be better for everyone to use Red as a decoy while they looked for the weakness in the feudal lord's magic. But when Teltina asked for Rosie's honest answer, Rosie admitted that it felt good to see Red getting beaten up, so he wanted to let him get pummeled a bit longer. Teltina said it was good that he was honest, but she still pleaded with him to save Red even if he didn't want to. Red had somehow managed to stand his ground to block the attacks against him, but he still couldn't find a moment to attack the summoner. Then suddenly someone threw a rugged-made bomb in front of him, and Red wondered what it was. It turned out to be a smoke bomb, and it immediately exploded in front of Red. The feudal lord quickly figured out who the smoke bomb came from. The smoke from it could be seen from far away, and whoever threw that smoke bomb managed to save Red and the party and take them to their hideout in the middle of the forest. Red also thanked his savior when they were being led inside the quarters of the ninja person they had talked to earlier. It turned out to be a woman, and she was irritated with Red because he had ignored her advice earlier not to meddle in the feudal lord's affairs. The party asked where they were now. The woman explained that they were now in the hideout of a resistance group whose goal was to reclaim their city. Teltina asked if they wouldn't be punished by the feudal lord for what they were doing, but the woman explained that the feudal lord's magic territory was only active inside his city walls. and because their hideout was outside the city walls, he couldn't detect them. The woman introduced herself as Grossa, the leader of the resistance. She asked the party why they were fighting the feudal lord, and after they explained, Grossa understood that Teltina's party's purpose was to retrieve the magic seed. Because of this, Grossa happily cooperated with Teltina's party, and she also gave them access to their facilities. Red thanked her happily, but Grossa said that she and the resistance should be the ones thanking them because the entire resistance's power wasn't enough to face the feudal lord without help from Red's party. Rosie asked why the resistance insisted on retaking the city when they could just move to another city to live in. Rosie couldn't understand why they were risking their lives fighting the feudal lord. Grossa agreed and said many of them had already left Acarina, but those who remained were citizens who loved their beloved city. Adola, Red, and Teltina thought about what Grossa said. The city of Acarina was always crowded from morning until night. This city was always full of life where you would always see different people. They just really loved their city so much that they really wanted to get their hometown back. Then Red's eyes suddenly widened when Grossa asked him if he also had something like that, a place he loved very much. Red remembered his 4 best friends from Kizuna 5 and their hometown. Red answered Grossa's question and said he understood them and that it was really a sad thing when a person couldn't return to their hometown. Adola also felt sad for Red because she knew Red's feelings were hurting too. But all Red felt now was determination to help the entire resistance retake their beloved city no matter what happened. Adola ruined Red's passionate moment because she reminded everyone that they still had no game plan against the feudal lord's privilege-type magic. Adola gave some consolation to Red, saying it was only their first time fighting the feudal lord. So it was okay that Red got beaten up in the first fight even though Adola hadn't expected the matchup to be that bad. Red had nothing to say to this, but Rosie laughed hard, enjoying Red's agony. Teltina scolded Rosie because there were things that shouldn't be said loudly. Fortunately, Grossa had already gathered vital information, and she gave Teltina's party a copy of the list of laws that, when broken, had corresponding instant punishment where a familiar would attack your blind spot. From the many laws, it was clear the feudal lord really didn't want any commotion inside the city. Then Red suddenly asked if he could just use the Kizuna Kaiser to fire a powerful gun from outside the city. Adola thought he was being stupid again and said if he did that, only ashes would remain of the city. Adola saw that the feudal lord's mansion was right in the middle of the city, so their normal attacks wouldn't reach it. Then, because the surveillance magic was still active in the city even at night, they couldn't do a night raid either. Then Red suggested again to use the Kizuna Kaiser to blow up the mansion. But Adola said if they made the Kizuna Kaiser rampage in the middle of the city, only a barren land would remain afterward. And Red couldn't fight properly using it because the feudal lord would just summon familiars inside his cockpit. Then Adola became reluctant to tell them all that she had an idea that might work, but it was the hardest game plan to execute among all she had thought of. Red and Rosie's faces were indescribable. After a while, they went out of Grossa's quarters and Red and Rosie formed a back-to-back formation. Teltina understood that if the two did this, they could cover each other's blind spots. But Adola wasn't very happy about this because this game plan had problems with it. Then Rosie suddenly got angry at Adola because he didn't want to fight relying on Red protecting his back. This was the first problem according to Adola. Rosie wasn't willing to do this. Second, Rosie would get burned from the intense heat from Red's transformation. And third, they couldn't cooperate. Just Red stepping on Rosie's foot made Rosie so angry that he couldn't help but attack Red. Adola told the two to do their best. Rosie suddenly answered that he was already doing his best. Then Teltina consoled Rosie. Next, she approached Rosie, who had kneeled before her, and told him that since he was the oldest among all of them, he should act like an adult and cooperate. Adola was surprised by Teltina patting Rosie's head like a mother. Rosie still didn't want to comply, but Teltina suddenly held Rosie's left ear and said she would give him something if he did well. Then Teltina whispered to Rosie the 2 magic words, ear cleaning and lap pillow. After this, they immediately completed their co-op training. That evening, Adola visited the local natural hot spring near the hideout to bathe. Then she suddenly heard someone ask what kind of relationship they had. Then Adola was surprised when someone suddenly tackled her into the hot spring. It was Teltina, and she said she was curious about what kind of relationship Adola and Red had. Teltina surprised Adola when she saw her and said it was her first time bathing with someone her age. Adola was surprised to hear that. Adola said it was also her first time. And here's the age reveal of the two. Adola was 16 and Teltina was 15. Only tonight did Adola learn they were about the same age. While Teltina was bathing, Adola was mesmerized watching her. She found Teltina very beautiful. Teltina asked Adola if she was thinking about something. Adola answered that she was just wondering because even though they were the same age, they looked very different. Teltina laughed and said that should have been her line. Then Adola submerged her head in the hot spring and asked why Teltina had chosen her. Teltina was surprised by her question. Adola explained that her family was the former royal family's wand, and there were many other more talented wizards in the capital who would be better choices for Teltina. Teltina didn't need to travel to a far place like Mises anymore. Teltina agreed with what Adola said. Then she admitted the truth to Adola that she had wanted to meet her in person for a long time. This shocked Adola, so Teltina explained that she knew that even after Adola's father died, she continued sending reports from House of Orn. Adola was surprised that Teltina knew about this. Teltina knew about Adola's documents that contained information that would improve people's lives. This included research reports about dangerous potion combinations. Teltina had long admired Adola's passion and her desire to use magic technology for others' benefit. And what was more admirable was Adola's patience in trying to return the title of royal family's wand to her family. Because of this, Teltina's heart was touched, and this was why she had long wanted to meet Adola, the girl her age who had a strong purpose in life. Adola was happy, but couldn't believe that Teltina herself had been reading her reports. However, Teltina added that after meeting Adola in person, she started doubting if they were really the same age. And the reason was the size difference of their chests. After bathing, Teltina walked back alone in the middle of the dark forest, and Red suddenly appeared out of nowhere and greeted Teltina. Teltina asked Red if he was planning to bathe too. Red answered yes because he had sweated a lot from their co-op training earlier. Teltina suddenly remembered that before she got out of the hot spring, Adola had said she wanted to soak a little longer. Then Teltina decided to lie and told Red that if he hurried to the hot spring, he would enjoy it alone while no one was there. Red was delighted and said how lucky he was. But before they parted ways, Red wanted to mention something to her first. Red asked about their plan for tomorrow, if Teltina really planned to follow them until they reached the mansion. Teltina answered yes, because she also had her own mission that only she could do. Then Red asked what that mission was, but Teltina just said it was a secret for now. Teltina was about to leave, but he asked one more question. He asked if what Teltina planned to do was something a princess like her should do no matter what happened. Red added that he was curious to know that, but not just that. In their very journey, what was the real reason for a princess like her to put herself in the middle of danger and threat from a privilege-type magic user? Then Teltina suddenly showed a serious aura and told Red that she was just like him. Red wondered what Teltina meant. Teltina reminded Red that he had just told them that before he came to their world, he had also faced the leader of the Kizuna Five's enemies alone to save the world. But instead of dying with the enemy, he was transported to another world. Teltina asked Red earnestly why he chose to fight alone, especially since he was a warrior of bonds. Red was stunned because he realized Teltina was right in what she was saying. Then Teltina said she knew Red's reason, and it was because he knew that fight would kill him, and he didn't want to involve his friends in a suicide mission. Teltina added that if one person's sacrifice meant the safety of many, she would gladly give her life. She was just like Red. But in the end, Red refused and said he had no intention of dying that day. Then Teltina suddenly lost her seriousness and said, "I bet you didn't." And she also said they were the same. Red was confused and couldn't understand where the conversation was going anymore. But in the end, Teltina told him she had no intention of sacrificing herself for their journey. So Teltina asked for Red's protection and called him Hero from another world. Then there was another person listening to their conversation and just hiding behind a nearby tree. Rosie's eyes widened because he heard everything, and it seemed he didn't like the interaction between Teltina and Red, especially Teltina's last words. But the two were done talking now, and Teltina told Red to go bathe because he already smelled of sweat. Rosie followed Red to the hot spring, and when Red was bathing, Rosie went to Red's clothes placed on a rock and stole something from his pants pocket. And you could also hear Adola scream in surprise, who wasn't done bathing yet. It seemed Teltina's plan to surprise and prank the two had worked. While Rosie was stealing Red's device, all that was running through his mind was intense jealousy. He wasn't happy that Teltina was friendly to Red and smiled at him, but what he hated most was that she called Red a hero. The next day, they went to the entrance of the feudal lord's mansion, but Red and Rosie went in first while Adola and Teltina were still waiting for something at the entrance gate. Inside, we can now see Red's face-off with the feudal lord again, who still had his familiars with him. But this time, Rosie was with Red. Red was so excited that he mentioned to the enemy that they had a secret plan to defeat him. Rosie got angry and said that shouldn't be mentioned to the enemy. Red started his transformation, but the device he used to activate his ranger form was missing. Red got nervous because he needed that device. Then Rosie asked him what the problem was. Red thought he had dropped his bonso plate somewhere, but Rosie knew that was the device he stole last night, so he just stayed quiet. Fear consumed Red because a familiar was about to attack him from behind, and he had no means to transform and fight. Then Adola heard the inner voice from the feudal lord's privilege-type magic again, and suddenly something exploded loudly where Red and Rosie were. But it looked different compared to Red's transformation explosion. Then Red's body was thrown far from the mansion into the water near the entrance where Teltina and Adola were. The two were shocked and worried for Red. Meanwhile, Rosie was still extremely bitter towards Red and said to himself that in their world, they didn't need Red and his bonds. Red's body continued sinking deeper into the water, and he just kept drowning. While he was still unconscious, Red's mind suddenly went into a flashback from his past. Red dreamed of a woman in a trench coat talking to him on a rooftop and telling him that having a bond was like having a sword. The woman also asked if Red agreed. Red just kept listening to her. Then the woman added that bonds were reliable, but if you couldn't handle them well, they would hurt you even more. You can't exactly have too many of these bonds either, because if you left one for too long, then it'll just rot away. And this too, once you have them, you'll be afraid of losing them and letting go. And this was the reason why Red was so vocal about his desire to have bonds. While the woman was saying this to Red, we can see her raising her fist and the Kizuna bracelet on her wrist peeking out. Then the woman faced Red and brushed her hair while saying she knew Red as someone who couldn't be alone. But their conversation suddenly stopped before the woman finished speaking because Red woke up from his dream. Red spat out a lot of water because Adola had just saved him from drowning. And from Adola covering her own mouth, it seemed she had just performed CPR. While both were still coughing, Red asked if Adola had saved him. Then Red told her that he felt like he had just woken up from a dream from his past. And Red thought this was what people referred to as life flashes before my eyes. But Adola was quiet and not responding to what Red was saying and wouldn't look at him, so Red was wondering. Because of this, he approached Adola and asked why she was staring elsewhere and if she saw something there. But Adola just told him that wasn't the issue. Then Adola tried to explain shyly to Red that even though her healing magic could heal wounds, it couldn't help someone who had stopped breathing. But because Red didn't understand what Adola said, Red just set her words aside and immediately asked what happened to Teltina and Rosie. Then Adola suddenly became extremely irritated and angry. She shouted at Red asking why he just said that aside, when it was her first time doing that. Red couldn't understand what Adola was saying because as far as Red knew, Adola had saved his life many times. Adola shouted back that that's not what she's talking about. Meanwhile, in Rosie's face-off with the feudal lord, someone suddenly called out to Rosie. Rosie was surprised to see it was Teltina, so he asked her what she was doing here and why she wasn't with Adola, who was supposed to protect her. Teltina explained to Rosie that Adola had just left her briefly to save Red, who had fallen into the water. Adola had asked Teltina to wait, but she disobeyed and went to Rosie to tell him that their plan had failed, so they should retreat and meet up with Adola and Red first. But while Rosie was preparing to unsheath his sword, he just said that wasn't a problem. Then he quickly attacked using Sacred Sword 5th form, Gratisilv, where long metallic crystals emerged from Rosie's sword. Using this, he managed to quickly kill two familiars and told Teltina that he was really her true hero anyway. Because of Rosie's powerful display of his power, The feudal lord immediately used the privilege-type magic from the magic seed in his hand to summon an enormous number of familiars and surround Rosie. But all the familiars surrounding Rosie immediately received one projectile each to their heads, and this came from his attack using Sacred Sword third form, in vain. In this form, Rosie's sword transitioned from being a beautiful sword into becoming a free-form plasma that could travel freely and branch out into many divisions. According to Rosie, he had already memorized the move patterns and positioning of the familiars from watching Red and the feudal lords fight. Teltina's worry lessened because she had confidence in Rosie's ability to utilize the transforming power of the royal sacred sword to counter the familiar's abuse of blind spots. Even the feudal lord was impressed when he saw the royal sacred sword's capability. We can see that he had immediately respawned 2 familiar bodyguards behind him. The feudal lord understood that he was now facing the hero chosen by the sacred sword itself, and no other hero had been chosen by this sword for the last 1,000 years. Now the story takes us to a flashback 2 years ago on a snowy night where Rosie was alone sitting on the side of the road looking rather disheveled. This was the night he first met Princess Teltina. She asked him if he was the rumored strong magicless adventurer Rosie missed. From their first meeting, Teltina immediately gave him friendliness and also quickly asked if he was interested in becoming a hero. According to Teltina, because Rosie had the sacred sword, it was an irrefutable proof of quality that he was a true hero. But Rosie refused and said it was impossible for someone like him who had no magic power to have that kind of quality. Then Teltina suddenly approached Rosie face to face and said that truthfully, Rosie's aloofness and honesty with himself were the very traits important for being a quality hero. Teltina explained that the royal sacred sword was formed by fusing 7 holy swords, and one of those holy swords had the ability to absorb magic power to compensate for the intense magic power consumption required by the sacred sword. But the caveat was that ability itself also applied to its wielder. So no matter how strong the warriors who attempted to wield the sacred sword were, they always just fainted upon touching the sword, because it immediately absorbed all their magic power. In this world, almost all living beings had magic power. So Rosie understood that as a person with no magic power at all, he was the only one who could wield the sacred sword. Teltina was so happy with Rosie that she couldn't help hitting him repeatedly. Then she immediately asked him if he wanted to come with her to save the world. Rosie refused the invitation. He had not even a tiny desire to become a hero. He told Teltina that his whole life was full of rejection and disdain from people just because he had no magic power. It made no sense to Rosie to save anyone's life, especially those who persecuted him and treated him as an abomination. Teltina was extremely shocked by Rosie's life and couldn't believe that was what he had experienced. Then Rosie said he didn't need anything except himself. Then Rosie suddenly received a warm and heartfelt hug from Teltina. Rosie was surprised by this and blushed. Teltina told him that because of what happened in his life, it was natural to feel that way. But while Teltina continued hugging Rosie, she asked if the reason why Rosie was hurt by rejection was because he wanted them to accept him. Teltina also asked Rosie if he wanted to be part of them, which was why he resented them for persecuting him. But even though Rosie was feeling intensely conflicted feelings, he still denied everything Teltina said. Then Teltina held Rosie's face and asked for his honesty. She promised him that as long as Rosie was willing to be honest with her about everything, she would always stay by his side. Whether it was about his anger at the world, or his deep sadness, or any complaints he had, Teltina would accept all of it as long as he was honest. Then Teltina gave Rosie another hug, and again requested that Rosie accept her offer to become her hero. Because of this precious memory, Rosie literally blazed while using Sacred Sword's second form, Dragloss. In this form, the sacred sword looked like it came from dragon claws. The surroundings also blazed while Rosie was saying that for the sake of Teltina, who saved him from the darkness and cold of loneliness, he would seize all magic seeds. The feudal lord applauded him for being a valiant hero, but he immediately punished him for being careless. And because no one was guarding the princess, the feudal lord summoned 3 familiars to attack her. The feudal lord greatly surprised Rosie, and because he was startled, he didn't notice the familiar in front of him that managed to disarm him. The sacred sword was thrown far away so Rosie couldn't retrieve it immediately. The feudal lord praised Rosie again and said he was strong, but clearly lacked experience in protecting others. Rosie quickly ran to tell Tina to protect her, but all Rosie could do was block the enemy's attacks using his own body. Then the feudal lord looked at Rosie menacingly and said he would pay for disrupting the city's order. The feudal lord even addressed him as a hero, as an added insult. Rosie had no choice but to accept the familiar's attacks to give Teltina a chance to run. So this is what he told Teltina to do. But in response, Teltina just held Rosie's cheek. With confidence, Teltina told Rosie not to worry, because they still had friends. Then Rosie was suddenly surprised to feel Red's swift arrival. He brought a powerful flying kick for the enemies to save Rosie and Teltina. Upon landing, Red immediately asked the two if they were okay. In response, Rosie just uttered Red's full name in disbelief. Red smiled at him. Idola made the next move using Overshade, where a black tornado appeared heading towards the familiars. Idola explained that her attack couldn't stop the familiars for long, but she had placed a magic power barrier to buy time for Rosie to recover. Rosie said not to worry about him and just take Teltina to a safe place. Rosie tried to move immediately, but Red stopped him from forcing himself. But Rosie still seemed bitter towards Red until now because he just brushed Red's hand away. He even shouted at Red and said not to touch him because he didn't need his help. Then, because of Rosie's reckless movement, he dropped something that Red suddenly picked up. But he immediately recognized it as his missing Bonso plate and was surprised to see it. Idola and Teltina wondered and asked why Red's transformation device would be with Rosie. Then you could see Rosie's intense nervousness as he sweated in front of the two women. Then Red held Rosie's shoulder to ask if he also wanted to transform into Kizuna Red like him, which was why he took his device. Rosie became dumbfounded at Red's question. Rosie tried to explain to him that wasn't the case, but Red wasn't listening anymore and just said he understood his feelings. Red confessed that he too really missed the good feeling that came from transformation. And while Red just kept talking like an idiot, Teltina approached Rosie. She held his cheek and asked for his honesty. Then, with trembling hands, Rosie held Teltina's hand to confess that he was afraid of Red. What Rosie feared would happen was that Red would replace him in his position as hero. Teltina couldn't understand why Rosie would say that. So Rosie explained his thinking. Red was a brave warrior of bonds who came from another world. And like Rosie, he and Red both had no magic power. So theoretically, Red should also be able to use the sacred sword. This was the real reason why Rosie tried to eliminate Red. So he couldn't steal Rosie's only place of belonging beside Teltina. Then Teltina held Rosie's hand back and told him she was like him too. Rosie couldn't understand what Teltina meant. While this was happening, Idola was still busy using magic to stall the familiars, and she was getting tired. So she asked her companions if they would take much longer with their conversation. According to Teltina, until she knew the people involved with the magic seeds, she couldn't get support or help from any noble or royalty. Teltina had long needed help from a knight, but at first, she really couldn't get any, especially since she was just a low-ranking royalty. And while Teltina remembered a bedridden loved one, she said that even back then she had a reason to save the world. She had a mission she needed to accomplish. Teltina always tried to save the world alone before. She struggled with this greatly until she finally found Rosie and had an ally, for the first time after a long period of being alone. This was why no matter how excellent and strong Red was as a quality hero, Rosie would forever remain Teltina's only hero, because Rosie was the only hero who took Teltina's hands that day. Then Teltina put her head against Rosie's chest and pleaded with him not to think about sad things like what he said earlier, because Teltina could never replace him. Now Red started telling a story about his past. Idola became extremely irritated by this because she would be forced to continue casting barrier magic. According to Red's friend, a bond was similar to a sword. It was a reliable thing, but once you had it, you would be afraid of losing it and you could hurt yourself because of it. But if Rosie and Teltina could acknowledge the strength of their bonds would surely become even stronger and more powerful. Then a mirage of a sword could be seen between Teltina and Rosie's hands as a symbol. And now that the misunderstanding between Red and Rosie had been cleared up, Red asked if Rosie would agree to form a bond with him too. Rosie's vision darkened and he refused. Then Rosie explained that regardless of what happened between the three of them and Teltina, from the start Rosie felt that he and Red really weren't compatible. Red asked why that was. And while the party kept talking, Idola was having difficulty keeping up to maintain the barrier standing. Rosie gave Red a reason, and he said it was because of his face. He explained that whenever he saw Red's face, it was like his eyes were burning. He didn't like Red's appearance that looked like a passionate justice hero. But we can now see that Rosie was holding the sacred sword again. Then Idola's barrier broke and the familiars attacked the party again. So Rosie said that because of the reason he mentioned earlier, Red should just keep his back turned to him when they fought together. Then Red happily said he also liked Rosie's stubborn side. Idola was so tired that she couldn't help but vomit. Teltina thanked her greatly for her hard work, but Teltina happily said they didn't need to worry anymore. Idola's face was indescribable because she was panting so hard. After Red's transformation, he said it was time to stop evil using his and Rosie's newly formed bonds. Rosie said he didn't remember anything like that happening. Now we can see the two rivals back-to-back like they did in co-op training. Because the barrier was broken, the feudal lord was free to attack the party. So he immediately used his greatest order where he summoned an enormous number of familiars simultaneously. But Red and Rosie's attacks were visibly coordinated to the point that they never separated from their back-to-back formation even once, while they continuously took down the familiars one by one until they got close to the feudal lord. The two managed to hurt the feudal lord's hand where his magic seed was placed. He couldn't believe he was on the losing side of the battle now, because he couldn't see any blind spots in the two's attacks. Then he panicked and shouted, asking where the two's intense coordination came from. Red and Rosie answered simultaneously. Red said it came from the power of bonds, while Rosie said it came from the power of hero. Then Red and Rosie together gave the feudal lord a barrage of fire punches and super slashes. And afterward, Red said, "Our bonds have prevailed." But Rosie countered this and said he hadn't formed any bond with him. Idola was now at ease and commented about the two that even though they had many disagreements, they still became in sync. But Teltina suddenly gave a warning to the two and told them to look behind them. A frightening phantom had suddenly just been peeking behind them, close to the two. What happened before in their first encounter with the magic seed happened again. The feudal lord was now the host consumed by the magic seed and was preparing to rampage as a black smoke monster. Red carried Idola and Rosie carried Teltina to run from the feudal lord's transformation. From the black smoke, it kept growing bigger and bigger while the party ran away from the mansion. But the feudal lord quickly obliterated his own mansion due to his transformation. After transforming, the party saw a giant monster head floating in the air. The citizens of Acarina could also see it, including Gross's resistance group in the forest. The feudal lord was now a giant ball whose width was almost as wide as the entire city of Acarina, and Idola was sure that if this fell directly on them, it would obliterate the entire land. Then Red suddenly brought out the Maximum Kizuna Kaiser and said that enemies suddenly growing huge was part of his battle routine. His companions commented that the routine he mentioned wasn't normal. Rosie asked where they suddenly were, but instead of Idola and Teltina telling him he was inside the Kaiser's cockpit, the two girls just became delighted. In their minds, they were just laughing at Rosie because despite all his negative words and actions toward Red, the truth was he had really formed a bond with him, which was why he was now inside the cockpit. While Red was flying the Kaiser upward to reach the feudal lord monster, his companions asked him what he planned to do. He couldn't just destroy the target because it would just fall on the city if he did that. Red said he knew that and wouldn't let the people get hurt and the city be endangered. So this is what Red did. He flew the Kaiser at full speed to push the feudal ball up into the sky until it was far away. And only when it was safe to blow it up would Red do so. Rosie was extremely surprised to see through the window that they were now above the clouds. Then Teltina suddenly realized that the safe place Red was talking about was the place above, beyond the sky. After just a moment, they had reached outer space. The three were amazed by space. Then Rosie also suddenly realized that everything they were taught about places where many angels lived above the clouds was all lies. Then Red explained that if they fought the feudal ball here, he could fight without hesitating. So, Red brought out the Great Kizuna sword. Inside the cockpit, a miniature version of the Great Kizuna sword appeared in front of Rosie. Then Red told him that he would be in charge of sword handling for the Kaiser. Rosie said he didn't like being ordered around by Red, but because he gave him such a beautiful view, he would consider it. Then while Red and Rosie were in sync with each other and the Kaiser, they faced the feudal ball that was preparing a powerful beam breath attack. They shouted, "Back-to-back bonds protect," and the sword of Aurora cuts through the void. And using the bravery Kizuna slash, Rosie's swordsmanship form could be seen in its pose. You could also see the literal cutting of the void in space that the Great Kizuna sword accomplished. And from a distant point of view, you could see what looked like a mini supernova explosion where the battle took place. From Ocarina City, this was visible as a super bright source of light. The citizens were happy in the end. So Red said that even though many things happened to them today, all's well that ends well, but Teltina still wasn't ready to celebrate. So Red and Adola looked at her. Teltina explained that whenever a magic seed went berserk inside its host, even if the host became unconscious after being defeated in battle, it would just come back to life after a few hours. And whenever this happened, they would become magical beasts again and would need to be fought and defeated again. And according to the current progress of its resurrection, where the magic seed had already regained the feudal lord's entire arm, it seemed they only had a few minutes left in their window. So they only had two choices for how to proceed. The first was to kill the host, and the second was to pull out the magic seed from the host's body. Red asked Teltina how they could do option number 2. But instead of answering, Teltina went straight into action, and her appearance changed to look like a white fox hybrid. She immediately used privilege release, Vrykolakas. Using this magic, a large flower appeared from her summon, and from this emerged a giant and mysterious spirit fox. Its size could be compared to Red's maximum Kizuna Kaiser. Red and Adola's worried faces sweated because they couldn't understand what Teltina planned to do. And they were probably also shocked by her power. But they were even more shocked when the spirit fox suddenly bit the feudal lord whole in front of them. Next, the spirit fox chewed the feudal lord. But instead of swallowing, it spat the feudal lord toward the water. The two had nothing to say about the strange thing they witnessed. Then they just saw that the magic seed was gone from the feudal lord's left hand. And though trembling, he was still alive. Next, Teltina explained to her companions that this was how to pull out a magic seed from a person's body. And this was also Teltina's duty. Because of this, Red asked Teltina who she really was. Meanwhile, a spirit monster could be seen flying above the city and had just arrived in Ocarina. But when we zoom in, we can see that it was a mysterious kaijin who also had magic seed powers. And from its mention about Red, the story seemed to show that it had faced other rangers before with different colors. This kaijin wore a skirt and had many floating gauntlets surrounding it, besides the giant crescent moon blade on its back. It said to itself that it needed to hunt the Red Ranger for the sake of Mao's revival.